The summer sun beat mercilessly upon the dusty Virginia roads as 35,000 Union soldiers marched southward from Washington, their blue uniforms already darkened with sweat and grime. It was July 21st, 1861, and General Irvin McDowell's army moved with the confident swagger of men who believed they were embarking on a grand parade rather than a battle that would define a nation's destiny. Along the roadside, carriages filled with Washington's elite followed the procession like spectators heading to a sporting event. Congressmen, senators, and their wives had packed picnic baskets and opera glasses, expecting to witness the swift crushing of the Confederate rebellion from a safe distance. The very notion that this ragtag collection of Southern farmers and planters could stand against the might of the United States Army seemed preposterous to these well-dressed observers. McDowell himself harbored deep reservations about the expedition. A career officer with graying temples and worried eyes, he had repeatedly warned his superiors that his troops were too inexperienced for such an ambitious campaign. They are not ready, he had argued before Secretary of War Simon Cameron just days earlier. These men have barely learned to march in formation, let alone fight as a cohesive unit. But political pressure from an impatient Northern public and press had forced the administration's hand. Onto Richmond, the newspaper headlines had screamed for weeks, echoing the battle cry that reverberated through every northern city. President Abraham Lincoln, his tall frame bent under the weight of mounting expectations, had finally given the order that would send these untested soldiers into their first real test of fire. As reported in the Washington Evening Star of July 20th, 1861, the atmosphere in the Capitol was one of supreme confidence and carnival-like excitement. Citizens lined the streets to cheer the departing troops, convinced that this single battle would end the rebellion and restore the Union. Within a matter of weeks, the Confederate forces waiting near the small town of Manassas Junction presented a stark contrast to their advancing counterparts. General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, a Louisiana Creole with piercing dark eyes and a perfectly waxed mustache, commanded approximately 22,000 men who had been hastily assembled from across the South. These soldiers, many still wearing civilian clothes mixed with whatever military equipment they could procure, possessed something their Union opponents lacked: the desperate determination of men fighting on their own soil. Beauregard had chosen his position with the calculating eye of an experienced military engineer. The meandering waters of Bull Run Creek provided a natural defensive barrier, while the rolling hills and thick woodlands offered excellent concealment for his artillery and infantry. He knew that if he could hold his lines long enough, General Joseph Eggleston Johnston's army of the Shenandoah might arrive as reinforcement, potentially turning the tide of battle. The night before the engagement, Confederate soldiers sat around their campfires, writing what many believed might be their final letters home. Private Johnny Whitten of the 1st Virginia Infantry scrawled by flickering candlelight to his sweetheart in Richmond, "Tomorrow we face the Yankees in earnest. I pray God gives us strength to defend our homeland against these invaders." Meanwhile, in the Union camps, the mood remained buoyant despite the officers' growing concerns. Colonel William Tecumseh Sherman, commanding a brigade of inexperienced volunteers, walked among his men trying to mask his own apprehensions. These soldiers, many of whom had enlisted for 90-day terms expecting a brief adventure, joked and sang songs, blissfully unaware that dawn would bring a baptism of fire that would shatter their innocence forever. As the first pale light of July winter first crept across the Virginia countryside, both armies prepared for a collision that would prove far bloodier and more consequential than anyone had dared imagine. The pre-dawn darkness of July 21st, 1861, hung heavy over the Virginia countryside as General McDowell's Union forces began their complex flanking maneuver. The plan, conceived in the comfortable confines of Washington war rooms, called for a diversionary attack at the stone bridge over Bull Run Creek, while the main force would cross upstream at Sudley Ford, sweeping around the Confederate left flank like a hammer blow. Colonel Daniel Tyler's 1st Division moved toward the stone bridge. As the eastern sky began to lighten, their footsteps muffled by the morning dew, Tyler, a gray-bearded veteran of the Mexican War, understood his role perfectly: create enough noise and commotion to convince General Beauregard that the main Union assault would come directly across the bridge. His artillery pieces, including several 30-pounder Parrott rifles, wheeled into position on the high ground overlooking the crossing. At precisely 5:15 in the morning, Tyler's guns opened fire with a thunderous roar that echoed across the countryside like the voice of an angry god. The Confederate soldiers manning the earthworks near the bridge dug for cover as solid shot and explosive shells screamed overhead, splintering trees and sending geysers of earth skyward. Captain John Davidson Imboden's battery of Virginia artillery responded immediately, their lighter field pieces barking defiance from concealed positions along the creek. The diversionary bombardment achieved its intended effect. General Beauregard, observing the action from his headquarters at Wilmer McLean's farmhouse, became convinced that this represented McDowell's main effort. The intensity and duration of the cannonade suggested a major assault preparation, exactly as the Union planners had hoped. Confederate reserves began shifting toward the threatened sector, weakening other portions of the defensive line. Meanwhile, General McDowell led the primary striking force of approximately 13,000 men on their circuitous march toward Sudley Ford. The route proved far more difficult than anticipated, winding through dense forests and across broken terrain that challenged even experienced woodsmen. Brigades became separated in the pre-dawn darkness, and what should have been a coordinated movement began to resemble a disorganized procession of lost units, searching for their proper positions. Colonel Ambrose Everett Burnside's Rhode Island Brigade, sporting distinctive gray uniforms that would later cause deadly confusion, led the advance toward the ford. Behind them marched the colorful Zouave regiments from New York, their baggy red trousers and Turkish-style fezzes making them appear more like theatrical performers than soldiers. These men, many of them Irish and German immigrants seeking to prove their patriotism, maintained their spirits despite the grueling march through unfamiliar territory. As documented in Harper's Weekly of August 3, 1861, the Union flanking column encountered their first serious obstacle at Sudley Ford itself. What military maps had depicted as a simple creek crossing proved to be a treacherous passage through thick underbrush and steep banks that forced soldiers to cross in single file. The delay stretched for precious hours, allowing the Confederate defenders time to detect the movement and respond accordingly. Captain Edward Porter Alexander, serving as Beauregard's signal officer, had positioned himself atop a tall pine tree with a powerful telescope, systematically scanning the horizon for signs of enemy movement. At approximately 8:30 in the morning, Alexander spotted the glint of sunlight reflecting off bayonets and brass buttons moving through the forest toward Sudley Ford. His immediate signal to Confederate headquarters read, "Look out for your left. You are turned." General Nathan George Evans, commanding the Confederate forces near the Stone Bridge, received Alexander's warning with the cool professionalism of a career soldier. A South Carolina native known to his men as Shanks due to his thin legs, Evans made a crucial decision that would shape the entire battle's outcome. Rather than remaining fixed in position to face Tyler's diversionary attack, he boldly stripped most of his men from the bridge defenses and rushed them toward the Henry House Hill area, where the Union flanking force would emerge from Sudley Ford. The race was on. Union soldiers, their blue uniforms now thoroughly soaked with perspiration, struggled through the final approaches to their objective, while Confederate defenders sprinted across familiar ground to reach defensive positions before their enemies could deploy for attack. The morning sun climbed higher, promising another scorching Virginia day that would test the endurance of both armies. As the two forces converged on the rolling hills around Bull Run Creek, neither side fully comprehended that they were about to engage in the first major land battle of what would become America's bloodiest conflict. The thunder of 30,000 pairs of boots echoed across the rolling Virginia countryside as Union and Confederate forces converged on the modest farmstead of widow Judith Carter Henry, her small white house, perched atop the hill that would forever bear her name, became the unlikely focal point of a battle that would shatter America's illusions about the nature of civil war. General Irvin McDowell's flanking column finally emerged from their tortuous march through Sudley Ford, deployed across the open fields with the precision of a West Point textbook maneuver. Colonel William Tecumseh Sherman's brigade advanced on the right, his men moving in neat company formations across the pastureland. To his left, Colonel Ambrose Burnside's Rhode Islanders maintained their distinctive gray uniforms, an unfortunate choice that would soon prove nearly catastrophic in the confusion of battle. The Confederate response, orchestrated by General Nathan Evans and reinforced by arriving brigades under Colonels Francis Stebbins Bartow and Bernard Elliott B., demonstrated the improvised courage that would characterize Southern resistance throughout the war. These men, many fighting their first major engagement, took defensive positions behind stone walls, in farm buildings, and along the tree lines that dotted the landscape. At 11:15 in the morning, the first major infantry clash erupted, as Sherman's Ohio and Pennsylvania regiments encountered Bartow's Georgians near the Henry House. The crack of rifle fire rolled across the hillside like sustained thunder, punctuated by the deeper boom of artillery pieces from both sides. Smoke began to drift across the battlefield, creating a gray haze that would only thicken as the day progressed. Colonel Bartow, a distinguished liar from Savannah, who had helped lead Georgia out of the Union, moved among his men with calm determination, despite the whizzing bullets that clipped branches and kicked up dust around his position. "Steady, boys," he called to his soldiers, many of whom were experiencing combat for the first time. "Remember, we're fighting for our homes and our honor." The Union advance, initially met with considerable success, McDowell's superior numbers began to tell as wave after wave of blue-uniformed soldiers pressed forward up the slopes of Henry House Hill. Confederate resistance, though fierce, appeared to be cracking under the sustained pressure. Several Southern units began falling back in disorder, their officers struggling to maintain cohesion as Federal forces closed in on their positions. Captain Charles Griffin's battery of regular Army artillery, the pride of the United States service, wheeled their guns into position on the crest of Henry House Hill with military precision. That spoke of years of professional training. These career soldiers, their uniforms still relatively clean despite the morning's exertions, began delivering devastating enfilade fire into the Confederate ranks below. Each discharge of their 10-pounder Parrott rifles sent deadly metal fragments screaming through the Southern lines, according to the Richmond Examiner's battlefield correspondent, writing in their July 23, 1861 edition. The Confederate position appeared desperate by midday. "Our brave boys were falling back in some confusion," the reporter noted, pressed hard by superior numbers and facing the galling fire of Federal artillery that commanded the field. It was at this critical moment that General Thomas Jonathan Jackson's Virginia Brigade arrived on the field, their arrival destined to earn their commander immortal fame. Jackson, a former professor at the Virginia Military Institute known for his eccentric habits and unwavering religious faith, positioned his men behind the crest of Henry House Hill in a defensive line that would not bend. General B, his own brigade wavering under the Federal assault, spotted Jackson's steady formation and reportedly shouted the words that would echo through American history, "There's Jackson standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer." Whether B intended the comparison as praise or criticism remains debated by historians, but Stonewall Jackson was born in that moment of crisis. The widow Henry, an 85-year-old invalid, who had refused to evacuate her home despite the approaching battle, became the conflict's most tragic early casualty when Federal artillery fire struck her bedroom. Her death, witnessed by horrified soldiers from both sides, served as a grim reminder that this war would spare neither combatant nor civilian. It is terrible arithmetic of destruction. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the battle for Henry House Hill intensified into a desperate struggle that would determine not only the day's outcome, but the very character of the conflict to come. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly down upon Henry House Hill as the battle reached its crescendo, transforming the peaceful Virginia farmland into a hellscape of smoke, screaming metal, and human suffering. General Thomas Jackson's brigade, positioned along the reverse slope of the hill, had become the immovable anchor around which the entire Confederate defense pivoted. Jackson himself presented an extraordinary figure amid the chaos, sitting ramrod straight upon his horse Little Sorrel, his kepied head tilted slightly forward as if in prayer. He seemed utterly oblivious to the Federal bullets that buzzed around him like angry hornets. His men, catching sight of their commander's supernatural calm, found their own courage reinforced by his unwavering presence. Private James Madison Stoneham of the 33rd Virginia later wrote, "The general sat there like he was carved from granite, and we knew that if he wouldn't budge, neither would we." The Union assault, initially so promising, began to fragment under the withering defensive fire from Jackson's position. Colonel William Sherman, his uniform torn by Confederate bullets and his horse shot from under him, rallied his Ohio regiments for another charge up the blood-soaked slope. "Come on, boys," he shouted above the din of battle. "One more push, and we'll have them." But the Confederate line held with the tenacity of men fighting for their homeland. Colonel James Ewell Brown Stewart's 1st Virginia Cavalry, having completed a wide flanking movement, suddenly appeared on the Union right flank like avenging angels. Stewart, a dashing 28-year-old with flowing beard and plumed hat, led his troopers in a thunderous charge that scattered several Federal regiments and captured the artillery pieces Captain Charles Griffin's battery, so recently triumphant, atop Henry House Hill, found itself in desperate straits as Confederate infantry closed to within musket range. The professional artillerymen, trained to fight at long range, struggled to defend their guns with carbines and pistols against determined Southern soldiers, who seemed to emerge from every fence row and farm building. The confusion of battle reached its peak when Colonel Burnside's Rhode Island regiment, still wearing their gray uniforms, approached Griffin's battery from an unexpected direction. In the smoke and chaos, the Federal artillerymen mistook them for Confederate reinforcements and held their fire until the last moment. This fatal hesitation allowed actual Confederate troops to close the final distance and overwhelm the guns. In brutal hand-to-hand combat, General Irvin McDowell, observing the deteriorating situation from his command post, felt the weight of impending disaster settling upon his shoulders like a lead blanket. His carefully planned flanking maneuver, so elegant in theory, was dissolving into chaos as inexperienced troops proved unable to maintain cohesion under fire. Unit after unit reported ammunition shortages, mounting casualties, and growing confusion about objectives and enemy positions. The arrival of General Joseph Johnston's Army of the Shenandoah marked the turning point that Confederate hopes had desperately needed. Johnston, having successfully eluded Union forces in the valley, brought approximately 9,000 fresh troops to the battlefield at the moment when Southern resistance appeared ready to collapse. These reinforcements, many wearing civilian clothes and carrying hunting rifles, poured onto the field with the enthusiasm of men who believed they were saving their cause from destruction. As recorded in the Charleston Mercury of July 24, 1861, the psychological impact of Johnston's arrival proved as important as the additional manpower. The sight of our Valley boys coming over the hill sent up a cheer from our hard-pressed soldiers that the very ground seemed to shake, reported their battlefield correspondent Colonel Jubal Anderson Early's brigade. Part of Johnston's arriving force struck the Union left flank with devastating effect. Early, a tobacco-chewing lawyer-turned soldier with a reputation for aggressive tactics, deployed his men in a sweeping attack that caught Federal forces completely by surprise. His Virginians and North Carolinians advanced with the rebel yell echoing from their throats, a sound that would haunt Union soldiers throughout the war. The tide of battle, which had flowed so strongly in favor of the Union during the morning hours, began its inexorable turn toward Confederate victory. McDowell's soldiers, exhausted from the pre-dawn march and hours of continuous fighting under the brutal July sun, found their resolve wavering as fresh enemy troops appeared on every flank. The first signs of Union collapse appeared not as a dramatic rout, but as a subtle erosion of confidence that spread through the Federal ranks like a contagious disease. Individual soldiers began glancing nervously toward their rear, calculating distances to safety and wondering if their officers truly knew what they were doing. The morning's supreme confidence had evaporated under the scorching Virginia sun and the grim reality of Confederate resistance. General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, sensing the psychological shift in his enemy's demeanor, made the bold decision to launch a general counterattack across the entire Confederate line. His orders, transmitted by signal flag and galloping staff officers, called for every available unit to advance simultaneously and drive the demoralized Federal forces from the field. "The enemy is wavering," he declared to his assembled commanders. "Now is our moment to strike the decisive blow." The Confederate assault erupted along a 3-mile front with the fury of a summer thunderstorm. Regiment after regiment of Southern soldiers emerged from their defensive positions, their battle flags snapping in the afternoon breeze as they advanced across the contested ground. The rebel yell, that distinctive high-pitched cry that combined elements of a war whoop and a hunting call, rose from thousands of throats to create a sound that Union veterans would remember with dread for the rest of their lives. Colonel Oliver, Otis Howard's brigade, positioned on the extreme Union right, became the first Federal unit to break under the sustained pressure. Howard, a deeply religious West Point graduate who would later lose his right arm in the war, watched helplessly as his Maine and Vermont regiments dissolved into a stream of fleeing soldiers. "My God," he muttered to his aide-de-camp, "there." Running like sheep, the collapse spread with terrifying speed. The 11th New York fires out waves their colorful uniforms now torn and bloodstained, abandoned their positions near the stone bridge, enjoying the growing exodus toward Washington. These men, recruited from New York City's volunteer fire departments and renowned for their fighting spirit, had reached the limits of their endurance after hours of combat in the stifling heat. Captain James Barnett Ricketts's battery, caught in the swirling chaos of the Confederate advance, found itself surrounded by Southern infantry who seemed to materialize from every direction. Ricketts himself fell wounded, along with most of his gunners, as the 33rd Virginia Infantry swarmed over their position. The loss of professional artillery units, the backbone of any 19th century army, accelerated the Federal disintegration. General McDowell, his carefully laid plans now in complete ruins, attempted to establish a new defensive line behind Cub Run Creek, but his exhausted soldiers, many of whom had been awake and marching for nearly 24 hours, proved incapable of coherent resistance. Officers shouted contradictory orders while their men streamed past in growing disorder. The careful military formations of the morning reduced to a mob of frightened individuals seeking only escape. The retreat quickly transformed into the panicked flight that newspapers would mockingly christen the Great Skedaddle. Federal supply wagons, overturned and abandoned, blocked the roads and bridges leading back to Washington. Teamsters cut their horses loose and fled on foot, leaving valuable equipment scattered across the Virginia countryside like the debris of a broken dam. Among the fleeing crowds were the civilian spectators who had come to witness what they expected to be a glorious Union victory. Congressmen and their wives, their picnic baskets forgotten, found themselves caught in the tide of retreating soldiers. Senator Benjamin Franklin Wade of Ohio, a radical Republican who had been among the loudest voices demanding immediate action against the Confederacy, now discovered himself fleeing alongside the very soldiers he had criticized for their caution. As documented in the New York Herald's July 23, 1861 edition, the scene on the roads to Washington defied belief. Senators and soldiers, teamsters and tourists all mingled together in one grand confusion. Their correspondent reported, the panic was complete and absolute, sparing neither rank nor reputation in its democratic embrace of terror. Confederate forces, though victorious, proved to disorganized and exhausted to mount an effective pursuit. Many Southern units had also suffered heavy casualties during the day's fighting, and their officers struggled to maintain control over men drunk with sudden victory. General Beauregard, despite pressure from subordinates to march immediately on Washington, wisely recognized that his army needed time to reorganize and resupply before attempting such an ambitious undertaking. As darkness fell over the Virginia countryside, the sounds of battle faded into an eerie silence broken only by the moans of wounded men from both sides scattered across the blood-soaked fields around Bull Run Creek. The pale dawn light of July 22, 1861, revealed a transformed landscape around the small Virginia crossroads of Manassas Junction, where peaceful farmland had greeted the previous sunrise. Now lay the detritus of America's first major battle, abandoned equipment, scattered personal belongings, and the still forms of men who would never see another dawn. The sweet summer air carried the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with something far more ominous that both armies were only beginning to understand. General Pierre Gustave Dutont Beauregard walked slowly across the battlefield, his immaculate uniform now dusty and stained, surveying the evidence of Confederate victory with the sobering eye of a professional soldier. Around him, Southern troops gathered, weapons and equipment abandoned by the fleeing Federal forces, their initial jubilation already giving way to the grim reality of what they had witnessed. Victory, they were learning, carried its own terrible weight. We have won a great triumph, Beauregard wrote to Confederate President Jefferson Davis that morning, but at a cost that should give us pause about the nature of this conflict. The general's casualty reports told a story that neither side had anticipated. Nearly 900 Confederate soldiers killed, wounded, or missing, with Federal losses exceeding 2,800. These numbers, shocking by the standards of 1861, would soon seem modest compared to the carnage that lay ahead. In Washington, the news of Bull Run's defeat struck the Lincoln administration like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. President Abraham Lincoln, his gaunt frame bent with worry, met with his cabinet in emergency session as reports of the disaster filtered back through the chaos of retreating soldiers. Secretary of War Simon Cameron, his face ashen with the realization of his miscalculations, tendered his resignation on the spot. Though Lincoln would refuse to accept it until later in the year, The political ramifications extended far beyond the capital, across the North. Newspaper headlines that had confidently predicted swift victory now struggled to explain the inexplicable. Our Waterloo, proclaimed the New York Tribune, while the Philadelphia Inquirer asked in bold type, how could this happen? The comfortable assumption that Southern resistance would collapse at the first serious blow had been shattered along with the Union Army's formations. General Irvin McDowell, the architect of the failed campaign, found himself the target of universal condemnation despite the impossible circumstances under which he had been forced to operate. His warnings about the inexperience of his troops, so prescient in hindsight, were forgotten in the rush to assign blame for the humiliation. Within days, he would be replaced by General George Brenton McClellan, a young officer whose confidence and organizational abilities seemed to offer hope for redemption. The human cost of Bull Run extended far beyond the casualty statistics. Families across both North and South received the telegrams and letters that would become tragically familiar over the next 4 years. Mrs. Sarah Bartow of Savannah learned that her husband, Colonel Francis Bartow, had fallen while leading his Georgia Regiment in the defense of Henry House Hill in Rhode Island. The wives and mothers of Burnside's brigade gathered at train stations to await the return of survivors, many of whom would never fully recover from their baptism of fire. Perhaps most significantly, Bull Run shattered the illusion that this conflict would be brief and relatively bloodless. Both sides now understood that they were engaged in something far more serious than either had initially imagined. The Confederate victory, while tactically decisive, had revealed the South's own limitations and the enormous challenges that lay ahead in fighting a prolonged war against superior Northern resources. As reported in the Richmond Examiner of July 25, 1861, even in victory, there was sobering recognition of the task ahead. We have proven that Southern valor can triumph over Northern aggression, their editorial proclaimed, but we must not deceive ourselves about the magnitude of the struggle that awaits us. This was but the first test of our resolve. The battle's aftermath also marked the true beginning of modern warfare in America. The telegraph lines that had carried news of the engagement to distant cities, the railroad cars that had transported Johnston's reinforcements from the Shenandoah Valley, and the photographic equipment that would soon document war's reality all pointed toward a conflict that would be fought with industrial-age tools and methods. In the quiet cemetery beside the Manassas courthouse, workers began the grim task of burying the dead from both armies. Confederate and Union soldiers lying side by side in the Virginia soil. Their shared fate offered a preview of the national tragedy that would unfold over the next 4 years, when American would fight American with a ferocity that would shock the world and transform a nation forever. The first battle of Bull Run had ended, but the American Civil War had truly begun.